Great. So, hi everyone. My name's Joe. If we haven't met before, if you haven't been to one of our sessions, I'm Joe, the Learning and Development Consultant here at Cornerstone Resources. My colleague Andrea is joining us for the Q&A part of the session at the end, so she'll be joining us throughout. If you have any questions throughout, please do scan the QR code on screen. I will also just put the link into the chat so you can look at that if you would like to enter questions via the web browser. So just bear with me one moment while I put that into the chat. So if you have any questions about any of the content as we go through, please do pop them in there and Andrew will pick them up in the last 5 minutes of the session. So as with other sessions, if you've attended this before, the aim really is to keep this practical and reflective rather than overly technical. So hopefully you'll leave with a few simple ideas you can apply back into your own recruitment processes straight away. Because today we'll be focusing on interview decision making and how can we reduce bias and improve consistency as well. So just to help us keep to time, because this is a short session through to 1 o'clock, we just appreciate if everyone remains on mute during the main presentation, but there'll be a few reflection points where I'll ask for your responses in the chat function. And like I say, please do contribute via the questions via the link I've just put in the chat, as well as the QR code on screen. So let's think about what we're going to cover today. First, we'll look at where interview decisions often start to drift and become inconsistent, because in many organizations, the biggest risks don't usually come from the interview questions themselves, but from how decisions are interpreted and discussed afterwards. We'll then explore some of the common biases and thinking shortcuts that we have that can really affect hiring decisions and often without us really realizing it. And then from there, we'll move into what strong interview evidence actually looks like, because one of the biggest differences between strong and weak recruitment decisions is usually the quality of evidence behind them. And then finally, we'll look at some simple ways to improve scoring, consistency, and panel discussions themselves without making recruitment processes overly complicated or bureaucratic either. Because the key thing really running through this session is that strong recruitment decisions rely on consistency, evidence, and structure, not simply instinct or first impressions. So before we get into that content, let's just start with a quick reflection question. If we just think about honestly about your organization or your recruitment experience, what tends to create the biggest challenge in interview decision making for you? So on screen, we've got scoring gaps, so that different interviewers might score the same candidate very differently. Number two, gut feel, so instinct, that might influence decisions more than evidence. Three, dominant voices, so just do strong personalities steer the panel discussion in a certain direction. Four, so thin notes or poor notes that don't really capture enough usable evidence. Or five, comparison difficulty, so candidates are hard to compare fairly across the panel. So what do you think jumps out to you? What creates the biggest challenge in decision making for you and your team? Just want to pop a number in the chat. If it's a mix, put a couple of numbers in, but if one just stands out to you, that's okay as well. There isn't a single right answer here at all. Most people experience different things. Great. So I can see a mix of gut feel, dominant voices, comparison difficulty coming through, scoring gaps. Yeah. So that's what I'd expect to see because, as I say, organizations experience things differently. They have different challenges. What's interesting, though, is that even organizations with good interview structures can still end up with inconsistent outcomes once human judgment, interpretation, and discussion come into the process. So one of the reasons this matters so much is because small inconsistencies in decision making can have very significant impacts on recruitment outcomes over time. When decisions are poor or inconsistent, we can end up with unfair outcomes, reduced diversity of thought and experience, decisions that are difficult to justify or defend, poor role fit, and ultimately missed talent opportunities as well. Whereas on the other hand, when decision making is stronger and more consistent, organizations then tend to see fairer recruitment decisions, better quality hires, stronger panel confidence, clearer rationale behind the decisions that we communicate, and then also better long-term hiring performance as well. So what's important here is that improving recruitment quality doesn't always require massive process changes. Often it's those small improvements in consistency, structure, and discussion quality, the quality of the discussion, that makes the biggest difference, really. One of the biggest causes of inconsistent hiring decisions actually appears before the interview even begins. Strong decision making becomes much harder when the groundwork hasn't been laid at the start, and any inconsistency we see often begins long before the first candidate has actually walked in, to be honest. Common gaps that create problems can include role requirements are unclear or contested, job descriptions too broad or unrealistic, panel members are assessing different things, different priorities, then actually what is defined as good hasn't actually been agreed either. Whereas stronger pre-interview practice could look like clarifying the key requirements for the role, identifying what success in the role actually looks like, agreeing which skills and behaviors matter most, and then also aligning the interview questions and the scoring to those priorities that you've defined as well. So what's really important here is that interview panels should assess candidates against role requirements and not personal preference, which is why it's so important to do that good work up front so that you set yourselves up for success as you go through. So what do we actually mean by a strong candidate? Because in interview discussions, what people can have different views on this. So I'd just like to drop a few words or phrases into the chat if you can think of any for this. What do you think people most commonly mean when they describe someone as a strong candidate? Give you a moment to think about this. Yeah, so thanks, Mark. So aligned with values and culture, absolutely. Experience, great. So we can see experience come through a few times, meet the requirements in the person specification. Yep, good fit with ethos. Strong, got the required skills, capable to fulfill the role. Yeah, so these are the examples that I'd expect to see. Confident, experienced, perhaps even the word polished might come through. Relatable, technically capable. So all those come through there. Have they got the competence as well? So this is where inconsistency often starts to creep into the process, usually not through deliberate unfairness, but through small judgment patterns that will gradually influence the outcome. For example, we've got interviewers may interpret scoring criteria differently. First impressions can start to take hold and then shape how later evidence is viewed. Confidence can become confused with competence. That's always quite an interesting one. And then candidates may start being compared against each other rather than against the role itself. And that's also something that's very common. What we also see is that informal discussion can also start to override structure. So if we have an unstructured post-interview conversation, that can undo some of the rigor that we might have actually put in place pre-interview and during interview as well. So most of that bias and inconsistency isn't intention unin is unintentional, sorry. That's the main thing to really take away here. We don't think people are intentionally doing things inconsistently. It's just what exactly, which is why having that structure really matters because things can drift. And this is also where gut feel often starts to enter the conversation as well. So instinct itself isn't automatically bad. Experienced managers often do notice useful signals during interviews, but the challenge is that gut feel can sometimes reflect things like preference or familiarity, similarity to ourselves or existing team members, communication style, the energy that people are giving off, the confidence or charisma of the person rather than their capability. As I've said, those first impressions people form, and then assumptions made without sufficient evidence for that assumption as well. So something to think about, and I'm not asking you really to put this in the chat, just to think about and ask yourself, have you ever left an interview with a strong feeling about a candidate but struggled to explain exactly why? And that's what we're getting at here with gut feel, because that feeling is worth examining yourself. Instinct can be useful, but it should be supported by evidence and not replace the evidence. So when gut feel leads to the decision, when it leads to decision making, fairness and defensibility over that decision are both at risk. And that's the key thing when we talk about gut feel. One of the interesting things about interviews, though, is that panels can sometimes unintentionally place a lot of weight on qualities that feel persuasive during the conversation, but don't always predict performance in the role itself, if that makes sense. So, for example, we might see that confidence over competence. Candidates who present confidently can sometimes be scored more highly, even though their examples contain less evidence. Communication styles, similar to our own, can feel like a stronger match. Polished or well-rehearsed answers over substance and thoughtful but less polished responses, or positive impressions that aren't fully supported by evidence. So that gut feel over clear evidence. And just to be clear, communication skills, confidence, and rapport absolutely can matter depending on the role. The risk comes when those things outweigh the actual evidence linked to the requirements of the role. So strong candidates do not always present in the same way, which is why structured assessment and clear role criteria really matter. Just to give you a bit more language to what I've started to speak about here, these ideas can be bucketed into what we call bias, so some common bias that affect interview decisions. These are essentially those cognitive shortcuts that we all have in some form, even experienced interviewers. So what these can look like, the first one is similarity bias. So preferring someone who is more similar to us might naturally warm more towards them. The halo effect, this is one where strong positive impression influences our overall judgment. Confirmation bias, this can happen when we begin looking for evidence that supports an early impression, perhaps, without even perhaps knowing that we're doing that, rather than assessing objectively. Recency bias, this can just mean we're often remembering the last interview more clearly than previous interviews, and that could sway our decision a little bit. And then confidence bias as well. So this is where the presentation style gets confused with genuine capability, perhaps sometimes. So what's important here is that recognizing that these are normal human thinking shortcuts. The goal isn't to pretend that these things don't exist or to feel bad about them if we do sort of carry these out. The goal is simply to build enough awareness and structure into the process to reduce their influence in the decision. And the encouraging thing is that many of these improvements are actually relatively small process and discussion changes that we can make. So if we just look at a quick scenario, I want to make this really practical for you. If we have candidate A, they interview confidently, build rapport quickly, communicate very smoothly throughout. The panel feels engaged and at ease. Candidate B, they appear quieter, more nervous, but give stronger and more role relevant examples with clear evidence directly linked to the role requirements. I'd just like to ask you, what risks could appear during the panel discussion afterwards? For example, could their confidence influence the scoring? Could assumptions be made about potential or capability? Could presentation style outweigh evidence? Are both candidates being assessed consistently, do you think? So just like to pop a number in the chat, or do you think all of them could be at risk or could be at risk? What do you think? Great. So I can see the confidence versus competence one. So is their style influencing the outcome? Absolutely. That could be at play. Yeah. So we've got scoring. So would they be scored against evidence alone? Evidence interpretation. Yeah, all of them. And I think that's it really. Absolutely. All of them could be a risk in some form. This is where strong panel discussions really become important. And that's something we're going to come on to shortly, because without that structure, panels can very easily drift towards whichever candidate they felt strongest emotionally about, to be honest, rather than which candidate demonstrated the strongest evidence. So one of the clearest differences between strong and weak recruitment decisions is the quality of evidence behind them. So good evidence tends to be specific, refers to a particular situation, action, or outcome. Observable, so it's based on what was said or demonstrated, not assumed. It's role relevant, so it's directly required to the requirements of the role, as we've started to talk about. Then it's also applied consistently, so in the same way across all candidates. Sometimes you might see this happen sometimes in evidence in practice. So someone might say they seemed professional. That is what we're talking about when we're talking about impression based. Nothing to score. You can't really score that or defend that if we say that they seemed professional. Whereas if we say they described how they managed a difficult complaint, explained the specific actions they took, and reflected clearly on the outcome. That's got the specific element, observable, and it's role relevant. So they might be saying the same thing, but you can see that the second one is far more evidence-based and matches up with these four criteria on the left as well. Again, just to give you an example from the notes side of things, I talked about what are called thin notes earlier on. Interview notes are effectively the foundation of the final decision-making discussion, so they're really important to be making good notes. Weak notes can leave huge room for interpretation and bias later on. For example, someone might say a good communicator. That's quite a vague statement, whereas a strong note could be explain the complex issue clearly to a non-specialist audience using a clear, practical analogy. So they've communicated in a good way, but you've got good notes behind that. Weak notes could be didn't seem confident. Instead, the strong note would be needed multiple prompts before providing structured responses to behavioral questions. That's something you can really reflect back on. A weak note would fit the team well. Instead, the strong note would be describe two specific examples of collaborative working, including the actions they took and the outcomes achieved. And then strong leader on the weak side gave a clear example of setting team direction during a period of change, including how they managed resistance. So you can probably see the difference here in that and how when you come back to that panel discussion, you've really got something that you can lean on and talk about. So the more vague the notes, the more room bias has to fill the gaps when that panel discussion does start. And this slide often reflects what recruitment decisions sound like in practice. On the left are examples of weaker decision-making patterns, so heavy reliance on gut feel, vague rationale, confidence being mistaken for capability, candidates mainly compared against each other. You'll often hear phrases like, they just felt like a better fit. I can't quite explain it. I just preferred them. Strong practice would look like having structured scoring against those role requirements, evidence-based discussion with examples, independent scoring completed before the group discussion. That's always quite an interesting one. So having not having other people influence your decisions. And so assumptions challenged constructively, and then also that clear rationale documented that you can defend as well. So you're really thinking about what evidence are we basing that score on? Did both candidates demonstrate this consistently? If you have two candidates there. So what does stronger practice actually look like when it comes to scoring? So before interviews, this is something we'd suggest. Agree criteria, define what good performance actually looks like, align with those role requirements. That's something we at Cornerstone can support you with if you need support there. Again, we can support you with this, but something we'd suggest with during interviews is scoring independently, capturing evidence, not impressions. And then after interviews, so comparing the evidence first and challenging vague statements if they do come up. Sometimes it takes boldness to do that, but it's reflecting on some of this good practice we've done today. And then what happens then is when you get that consistency, it improves when every panel member is assessing candidates in a the same way, against the same standards at every stage. Because this is where the panel discussions really matter. This is where essentially your recruitment decision is ultimately won or lost, really. The actual discussion a panel has is what determines the outcome in most cases. So it's important to think about how these discussions will go or be structured too. People can put the work in before and during, but that can become really unstructured at this point if this bit isn't really thought about. So unstructured panel discussions can sound quite vague. You might say things like this. I just don't think they were quite right for us. Similar to what I'm saying on the previous slides, really. The other one felt stronger overall. I'm not sure they'd really fit in here. I'm sure we've all heard this kind of discussion at some point. Whereas a more structured discussion is anchored to the evidence. So you're asking what evidence is supporting that view. Which requirement are we assessing here? Are we applying the same standard to all candidates? And what I would just encourage you to do is if you start to hear stuff on the left-hand side, actually saying the questions on the right-hand side can really bring the conversation back into a more structured place. But obviously, if everyone's approaching this the same way, everyone would know about this stuff and would start doing the stuff on the right-hand side anyway. So good panel discussions focus on evidence and role requirements, not assumptions or the personal impressions. And as we just start to wrap up the presentation side of this session, these are probably the simplest practical improvements organizations can make immediately. You can use structured scoring consistently, complete individual scoring before group discussion begins, Challenge vague comments or assumption-based comments if you hear them, and then also document your rationale clearly enough that the decisions could be confidently explained or justified later if you needed to. None of these changes are especially complicated, but together they can significantly improve the fairness, quality, and consistency of your recruitment decisions if you are able to implement these. And one of the reasons this topic matters beyond recruitment is because many of the skills involved are actually broader leadership skills. Things like making balanced decisions, challenging assumptions constructively, communicating objectively, leading discussions well, and also then creating accountability and consistency. So many organizations find these same challenges don't appear just in recruitment conversations, they appear across wider leadership practice as well. And this is just something I wanted to raise really, that these are things we do explore in our leadership program called Lead with Confidence, a people management program that I deliver, focused on becoming confident as a leader really, and learning the skills on the left-hand side that would then help you with your decision making in interviews as well. So I'd encourage you to think about whether you think yourself or someone in your team or organization would benefit from joining us. We're running a program in September and October for our next cohort, whether they're moving into management, new to leading people, never had formal training, or would just benefit from a refresher, then that program is really relevant for them. So, encourage you to have a think about that as well after the session. So, as we finish the main content, I just want to leave you with one final reflection question. Out of everything we've talked about quite quickly, I realize in the last 25 minutes, what is one practical change you could make in your next interview process to improve fairness or consistency? It might relate to scoring, note taking, panel discussions, comparison, or documentation. I just encourage you to pop a word in the chat, so one of the options on screen, just to give yourself something to really commit to and think about focusing on next time you have a recruitment cycle. Great, so we've got comparison, scoring, excellent. Keep them coming through. I'll just ask Andrea while this is on screen. Have we had any questions, Andrea?
No questions so far.
No problem. If you have any questions, feel free to still pop them in that link if you just want to scroll up the chat, and we can come back to you afterwards. If you just want to leave your name or your email, that would be great. Just to look at these the answers coming through again. Good to see a good mix, and hopefully this session's been helpful to give you some things to sort of mull over beyond the session. I will send through the recording either later today or early next week, as well as the slides, so you can reflect back on them as well. But thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, we'll just stay on for the last 5 minutes. But otherwise, do pop them in the chat as well. Oh, sorry, into the Mentimeter link. Thank you, everyone. Take care and have a great bank holiday weekend.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate your comments.